action has to happen or not happen before March the 1st. If you will remember, back on the ballot in November in the general election, there was a constitutional amendment that allowed the creation of this floating homestead exemption, and it also then gave a blurb about that there's also a mechanism for cities or municipalities to exercise a mechanism to get out of it if they didn't want to put it into place. So we have been researching this. We've spent a lot of hours talking about it. I want to also recognize that we've had Mr. Blackaby join us in case we have some legal questions that come up surrounding this that we need clarification on. But this is really just an opportunity this time right now, next 25 minutes for council to discuss it a little bit more, ask any questions that we have, and then at 6:30 when we have the special call meeting, we will actually take a vote on which way we are going to proceed with handling this. So I'd like to kind of start out maybe giving some of the basics and just encourage any of the council to chirp in on any areas where I kind of might leave it out. So the fundamental part of this is that it was created with a very short time frame. It went into effect January the 1st when it did pass, and a decision has to be made by March 1st or you are automatically opted in to this statewide homestead exemption. It's called a floating exemption. Essentially, we all here in the county, Camden County, have a fixed exemption on our county taxes right now. So whenever you applied for that, the value of your home was fixed at that value and you're assessed on that value, even though over time that value has most likely increased. Your city taxes, on the other hand, are based on your current assessed value, 40% thereof. But so there may be people who've been in their homes for 25 or 30 years and might find that they are actually paying a little higher city taxes than they are county taxes because of this exemption, even though the millage rate for the city is significantly lower than the county. And so that's kind of how that comes about. The option before us tonight is either to opt out or to do nothing, essentially opting in. If we opt out, there has to be 3 public hearings where we hear from the public more about it. We can answer questions, we can disseminate more information about the decision before us. And at that point, we could still later decide to do nothing, and it would automatically happen March 1st. But in order to start this process, if we decide that we want to opt out, we would have to opt out and start a process where we can schedule 3 public hearings. And then after the conclusion of those hearings, if we still want to opt out, we would have to do a resolution, send that to the Secretary of State's office before March 1st. So that, I believe, is the basic process. And then it comes into, there was another part of the bill that allowed us to potentially vote in a floating local option sales tax. And that would have happened at a later date, but that would have allowed us to further reduce the millage rate on property tax and supplant that with income from a sales tax. But the caveat to that in the bill was that all of the authorities within the county that are taxing authorities all have to be participating with this floating homestead exemption in order to have that floss even be a possibility. So right now we're hearing some of the other municipalities. We already know that Kingsland has also started this process to opt out. Whether they continue to do that, time will tell. But that would effectively take it off the table of having a floss if one municipality did make that decision. The other thing about this floating and what makes it a floating homestead exemption is it would change each year based on the inflation rate as set by the state. Most likely the
Consumer
price index. Thank you, Lynn. But whatever metric they decided to use. So you would still see an incremental increase over time. It wouldn't be a totally fixed rate like the county has with your county taxes. So it might go up 1 or 2 or 3% depending on what the inflation rate is for the year. So think I've kind of laid out the basics. Lynn? You wanna-
One of the other things that we need to think about as a city is our existing TADs. Because our city management has done some projections about what kind of property value, assessed value increase would be required in those TADs to cash flow our bond payments. So the biggest one of those is TAD 2 with the Exit 1 development. And Mr. Blackerby, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that this House bill would impact the homesteaded property only in those TADs with respect to the amount of value that would be
That's correct.
assessed.
It would apply to only homesteads throughout the city, but it would apply regardless of whether they're in a TAD or not.
Right, so it potentially impacts, well, TAD 2, TAD 3, which is a pay-as-you-go TAD for the developers' incentives, and,
Any residential in TAD 1.
right. So, my understanding is that when we did the cash flow analysis on property value increases for TAD 2, which is the Exit 1 project and our largest bond debt, is that we did that at 1% increase year over year.
That was what was provided by KB, who did the analysis for us.
Okay, and that increase in assessed value was able to cash flow the bond payments.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I haven't seen that, and I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but, one of the things I would like to see happen is that we start the process of opting out, in other words, holding the meetings. And while we're doing that, we can continue to accumulate some information and review everything to make sure that we have all the data we need for a good decision. And the other piece of data that seems to float around that I haven't seen confirmed, which I'd like to confirm somehow with the Georgia Department of Revenue, is the amount. We have been told that our FLOST, if we are able to implement it, and it would have to go to a referendum, it has to go to the voters to be implemented, would most likely mimic LOST. So we have been told that, or I have heard that LOST revenues are provided 30 to 40% by people that are not in any of our 3 zip codes.
That's correct.
But I haven't seen a source for that data. So if that's correct, then the House bill itself is shifting some of the tax burden from homeowners to a consumption tax. And if we can get some of that consumption tax paid by transient visitors to our cities and, to the county, then that's something that we need to consider, I think.
I think it was estimated 400,000 people come down the I-95 corridor on an annual basis last year. So that kind of gives you some numbers to work on, but I understand what you're asking for.
I'd like to know what the actual
percentage.
1% revenue is. Because the FLOST, and this, so I know we're dealing with SPLOST also, and that's a totally different situation. The FLOST would go to referendum as well. As I understand it, we would not be able to take it to a referendum if we are able to at all until sometime in November.
That's right.
And that revenue, whatever it is, can only be used to reduce the millage rate. So, it'd be easy to follow the money on that. we just have to decide as a community how we want to do that. And I think it's great that we have the public hearings and we'll hear that.
Yeah, those are very, very good points that Mr. King made. I do like the idea of being able to take some of the tax burden off of our homeowners if we could implement like a FLOST. But if, Kingsland opts out, then it kind of closed the door on us being able to opt in. If they didn't opt out and we had the option to do a FLOST tax, we do have local, a group of local population that's against local option sales taxes, and the SPLOST is, being opposed. So if we have to do 2 ballot referendums and the FLOST fails, if we were able to go for a FLOST tax and it fails, it's important to remember that the bill sounds great and it has a good intention of the homestead, but it's not a reduction of your taxes. It's just getting taxes from another area to make up for the revenues that we wouldn't receive for the homestead exemption. So if there is no FLOST to back it up, the only other spot to make that up is by re-increasing the millage rate, and you're right back to where you started. So if that's the circle we're going to be in, or cycle we'd be under, there's not enough net benefit provided that we should even jump into something to have to make now a zigzagged line to wind up with the same end result in your property taxes.
I agree with that.
So, if we opted out, yes, there's a measure where we could try to mirror it if we found another net benefit down the road, but I don't think now we've been given enough information. But I do like the idea of possibly, when we vote later on tonight, just voting to start the process of opting out to have those public hearings, but we could still opt in if we get some new information during this period of time.
Thank you, Mr. Ingram. Anyone else? There was one thing I did want to point out, I guess, about the way homestead exemptions in general, obviously, as a certain proportion of the population who is in their forever home or there for a long time, benefits the most, obviously, from having their homestead exemption put into place. It does create potential inequities, if you'll call it that, with, you could have 2 houses in a neighborhood very similar that had an initial value very similar, and over 20 years, one was a single homeowner, stayed in that house forever. The house next door, changed hands a few times, got reassessed every time it did, and then you see down the road that this person's paying twice as much in city taxes as their neighbor with the essentially the same house. And that's what homestead exemptions are about. We already have that situation with our county taxes. If you have a county homesteaded house, you could be paying substantially less taxes than your neighbor who's new to your neighborhood. And that's the reality of the situation. There are always little inequities that occur. If Mr. Ingram's house gets assessed this year and mine doesn't get assessed for 2 more years, there's a potential imbalance for a couple of years there where he's paying a little more in taxes because I'm further behind him in assessment. So these are a fact of life. We'll never be able to eliminate them, totally. But what this does do over time is it will shift the tax burden to the non-homesteaded resident, the renter, the small business, commercial properties will over time be paying a larger share of the tax burden coming from property taxes. And maybe that's desirable, maybe you feel otherwise about that. It's hard not to, as a homeowner, to just want to have your taxes lower. And I'll tell you, personally, I live downtown, very close to some property that's sold for roughly 9 times its assessed value. And I kind of roll over at night thinking, is my property going to get reassessed at 9 times its current value? And am I going to be able to afford that? So personally, I would, opt in for my own personal, good, but I'm not sure that is, I'm interested to hear what our public has to say if we do move forward with the public hearings and see what everyone has to say about that, and what you think is the best way for our community to move forward as a community. And so, I look forward to the process if that sounds like where we're going, but we'll determine that at 6:30, but.
Right.
One other
Oh,
thing,
Go ahead.
if I may. So what we're actually voting on is if we're going to stay in, obviously we're going to stay in, but if we're opting out, we're not actually voting to opt out now because we have to have the 3 meetings. One thing, and it looks like you said, we're going in that direction, I'd like to see is kind of take some time and figure out, because we have till March 1st, when those 3 meetings are going to be. And then not only do we have time to make up our minds, but that's when we'll actually do the vote to
I
opt
believe
out.
staff already has some dates proposed.
Okay.
Hear them now?
Sure.
Yeah. Excuse me while I go get them.
Okay.
Okay, I'd like to add a couple of other points. I don't know if we've spent a fair amount of time just thinking about this, talking about it, going over the rules and everything, so we've kind of worked it out in our minds. But for your benefit, I think it's important, to Greg's point, to make sure you understand that even if there is an inflationary cap, that does not apply to any sale of a home, which would increase the value, or any substantial addition for which a permit is pulled. So any turnover in our homesteaded property would increase beyond the CPI during the period of time. And there's another piece of information that we have, that since you've got the dates, go ahead and give them to us.
Tentatively, right now, we have February the 3rd. Time has not been determined. We do have to have one of these 3 meetings at 6 p.m., which I would recommend it be the last one. That way we could, if there's a vote needed, we could do it immediately following. There'll be one the week of the 10th and one the week of the 17th. Hard numbers we do not have at this point, but we'll have them by first thing in the morning. Well, yes.
Week of the 10th and week of the 17th.
So in the week of the 17th, we have President's Day on the 17th, so we will not be having a council meeting normally, I guess. Will City Hall be closed that day?
Honestly, I don't remember. Are we? Yes.
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 Ask one of the employees.
That's why I had to look.
She knows.
So yeah, right, so most likely would not be on the
She knows the day
17th, but
off.
we could have
Right.
another day that week, so. All right.
Okay. So my apologies, ma'am.
No, good, thank you.
One of the other, I read a PowerPoint, I guess that was from
GMA.
DeKalb County put out for their residents to look at this. And so I'm going to ask City to prepare something like that we can get up on the website quickly, that really gives the bullet points for everyone to be able to look at this. And so hopefully in the next few days we can get something up on the website that covers the things we've talked about, how the program's laid out, the ins and outs of the FLOST, and how, whether that can be used or not used, and try to get something that's it's very convoluted, some of this really, and but hopefully we can get it presented in a way that is easier to understand, and people can make informed decisions about how some of this might affect them. One of the things that you see in the housing market, is if someone has that homestead exemption, they may be reticent to sell and to move because they don't want to put themselves into a situation where now all of a sudden they're having to pay higher property taxes, and that creates a less of a turnover for the new home buyer. This person's not moving up to a bigger house, they're just staying in their original house, and so the underside of the market stays void of potential properties for new home buyers. So just some of those market driven things that this can affect, the unintended consequences, if you will. But that's kind of the decision before us. Anybody else have anything they want to add?
Ever since this bill was signed several months ago, I've been back and forth. I want to go with it, then I'm against it. And every attorney that I talked to, including attorney Mr. White there, says that it's confusing and nobody understands it. But seriously, it's nobody knows exactly what we're getting into. I talked with the 3 of the county commissioners, and they said they're just going to just leave it as is. In other words, they're not going to opt out. The city of Kingsland, they're trying to opt out.
Well, they've begun the process.
Yes.
And they still have, they shared an analysis with us that I wanted to share with all of you, and that is, and Marcia Klecken, thank you for preparing this, but she did an analysis that showed with our historical assessed value, which is 40%, if we would have implemented only a CPI increase in the homestead assessed base, year over year, in other words, we would have lost revenue, tax revenues, from 55,006 being the lowest to 363,000 being the highest. And then we are looking at lost revenue now, which again approximates what we would get from FLOST, as being approximately 3.2 million a year. So that FLOST revenue, in a scenario where Kingsland decides they don't want to opt out because they get a lot of feedback from public, and we decide we don't want to, we could potentially take the lost revenue of 3.2, which would approximate the floating local option sales tax, and reduce our millage rate, which would also reduce the millage rate on non-homesteaded property. So there is potential for reducing, it's not just about the homesteaded property. There is some potential, since this the floating local option has to go against the millage rate for reducing the tax rate on other properties. But again, as everybody points out, lots of moving parts. We won't really know how this is all going to turn out until closer to March 1st. And Stephen, I have one question for you, Mr. Blackerby. What is the latest? All these things that we have to file at the very end are filed electronically, right?
When you submit the resolution to the state?
Yes.
I don't know that the statute spells out how that's to be transmitted. I would assume it could be submitted electronically. I would be shocked if they required it in paper format.
Okay. So what would our lead time be on asking for those end stage documents to be prepared and filed? What's the lead time for you?
That should not be difficult, because I think GMA has already prepared drafts of all those documents that could easily be just reformatted and used as a template. So that would not take much time at all.
Okay.
All right, well, as we're getting within 5 minutes of the town hall, we'll go ahead and close this work session. And we'll reconvene at 6 o'clock for the...
You have 6:30 for the...
That's for the special council.
Oh, gotcha, I see.
6 o'clock.
We got 4 meetings tonight. Both.
6 o'clock.
Town hall.
Town hall.
We had the master plan update, that work session, town hall, and then a meeting.
It's a lot.